Like way over, you're on this side. I'm used to seeing you over here. Well, your family. I'm used to seeing Lisa over here, yes. Because what I was going to ask is, like, everybody's sitting over here, and I was wondering if your right side was your good side. So that's what I was trying to look and see if your right side was your... Okay. I'm going to tell you, I'm very excited to be up here this morning, and I've had a few people ask me if I'm nervous, and I'm like, well, not until you ask me. I was like... But no, I'm glad to have the opportunity to share, and it is a humbling thing to have the opportunity to share with the people that you worship with, because, again, I'm not the one that God has called here to bring the Word every Sunday and to make sure that you're getting fed, but I do have the opportunity to do that today, and when I realized I had that opportunity, I wanted to make sure that I was doing so, again, from the perspective of one of you. I don't want to get up here and preach to you this morning. I kind of want to bring about a message that we all can relate to, as me being one of you. So a few months ago in March, Jim started a sermon series. And every time I even said that, I thought that was kind of funny to say, because it's not really a series in series. It's called Extraordinary, Ordinary People, Extraordinary God. And how he kind of prefaced this was, he's going to be preaching throughout the year, and he started this series, but if there ever comes a time where he's in between sermon series and he wants to throw this in, he's going to kind of throw this in there for us, so we need to be ready every once in a while to hear a message about extraordinary, the ordinary people, extraordinary God. So I had already had this message planned when Jim approached me maybe last week to say, well, you don't have to stay in line with the series that he's already preaching, or it could be part of the extraordinary series. And I really didn't have it planned for any of that. But of course, the way that it works out, it fits into this sermon series. So I did, later on, I told Jim, I said, you know what, it is going to be extraordinary. Of course, I didn't mean to be boasting at that point. I think he kind of laughed, and he's like, oh, aren't you humble? But no, it's going to fit into this extraordinary, ordinary people, extraordinary God. But I want to define or redefine, maybe define again, because I'm sure Jim covered this when he first preached on extraordinary, what the word extraordinary means. Because I think it's going to be important for us to know today. I found this definition very remarkable, very unusual, or very different from what is normal or ordinary. And that's what I want us to kind of cling to today as we try to get what we're going to find out in this message is that very different from what is normal or ordinary. I just love that part of the definition, so I'm going to kind of be focusing on that part of it. And of the people that he's introduced to us so far, Esther, David, John, and Peter, we've heard some messages how God took these ordinary people and did extraordinary things through them, and I think you would all agree that, again, they are extraordinary. If we were making our Extraordinary People Hall of Fame, you would list those in there because they were, by all appearances, ordinary, but then God used them to do extraordinary things, and they are very well known to us. Well, the person that we're going to talk about today is nameless. Does not have a name, however, we will see that this person is indeed extraordinary, very different from what is normal or ordinary. And Jesus introduces us to this person in the form of a parable. Another definition for you, because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page before we move forward. So, parable. A few weeks ago in class, Chris brought this up. He was teaching from Mark, and there was a parable in there, and so he defined parable for us. And one of the most commonly used definitions of the word parable, I would say, is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It's just a story about our everyday lives, insert heavenly meaning at the end of the story. I found this other definition that I liked, which has a definition within a definition, because I had no idea what mashal was. So it said a mashal, and then I insert the definition of that, a sentence of ethical wisdom that employs a short narrative fiction to reference a transcendent symbol. And I love that because it's a fictional story. It could be true, but it's not. He makes up the story. It's a fictional story, but it's to reference something greater than what that story is, a transcendent symbol. And I thought, okay, these guys have their own definitions of parable, and I like to maybe throw my definition in the hat for us today. So I came up with this definition for parable. It is the mother of all kingdom truths bomb. You got it, okay? Even got Jay Faulkner there, so that is mine. Mother, because you know when you've heard the term truth bomb, right? I know you've heard, I'm about to drop the truth bomb. Well, here you go. This is the mother of all kingdom truths bomb. And I know recently we've heard the mother of all bombs. Well, this is the mother of all kingdom truths bomb. What this MOAKTB, that kind of rolls off the tongue, is meant to do is to expose a kingdom truth or a desired kingdom behavior. Expose a kingdom truth or a desired kingdom behavior. So at the end of this MOAKTB, you should then be exposed to a way that Jesus wants you to live and act in the present kingdom of heaven. If you are trying to be someone who is successfully ministering to others, bringing the gospel to others in the kingdom of heaven, this is one of the traits or desired behaviors that you should have in order to be successful in this kingdom. So that's why he uses these stories to kind of reach his audience. The stories are somewhat unbelievable to the audience because they're like, nah, that would never happen. Of course, again, it's not something that is science fiction, just fiction. So it is something that could happen, but they say, no, that's too far-fetched. That would never happen. But it's almost an exact representation of what is taking place. That's what I love about it, because you're like, oh, that would never happen, but you're like, well, wait a second. It is happening. And that's the way that Jesus kind of lays out these parables. What do you prefer, parable or MOAKTB? Well, I'll say parable. I'll say parable from now on. Maybe drop in the other one every once in a while. Okay, so turn, if you would, to Luke chapter 18. That's where we're going to be today. And we're going to see one of the parables that Jesus uses to expose his audience to a desired kingdom behavior so they can be effective ministers of the gospel in his kingdom. So in Luke chapter 18, 9 through 14 is where we're going to be. And I want you to know, if any of you, and I know we have some school teachers in here, and Sunday school teachers, anytime you've ever taught, and you're sitting there teaching, and all of a sudden, you know, maybe the class has been acting a certain way for a few weeks, and all of a sudden you get to that point, you're like, all right, wait a second, I got to stop. We need to have a talk. I think that's how these parables come about. See, Jesus has been paying attention to his disciples, to his followers, not just his disciples, but those that were following him. And it comes to the point where he's like, okay, all right, it's lesson time. Okay, we need to get off script just for a second, and I need to sit down and tell you a story. So that's what Jesus does in this parable. And I love it because in verse 9, and Luke is writing this, okay? Luke is writing this after the fact. He's not writing this as it's taking place. So he knows who this is written to after the fact. But when it's being said, it's not necessarily clear who it's being said to. But Luke is able to tell us, the reader today, who it was written to. And he does that. In verse 9, he says, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. And I love that because he doesn't say any specific individual or group of individuals. He just says, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else. Now remember the people that have been with Jesus for, this is towards the end of his ministry, so about 3 years. He obviously has had some self-centered disciples, right? Hey, who's going to get the seat of honor? You know, they've been kind of concerned about who's first versus, you know, being last. And he's also been surrounded by some self-righteous Jews, which we would call maybe Pharisees or teachers of the law. Confidence of their own, here's a new word for you, uber religiousness. I'll say that a few times today too. So their confidence of their own righteousness. And those are the people that he's been kind of, having to deal with for the last 3 years. And so I like to imagine that maybe something took place. He overheard a conversation, someone claiming how righteous they were, or that they should be before someone else in the kingdom of heaven. And all of a sudden Jesus is like, all right, stop. It's story time. Let's just sit down. All the little kids come up front, crisscross applesauce. If you're a teacher, you know what that means. Let's just sit down. I got to tell you a story. And I would have to say I'd be nervous about, they've heard some stories from Jesus before, and they knew how some of them ended, and not always in their favor. So they probably had to be a little bit nervous when Jesus stops to start teaching. But here we go. That's who at least Luke sets us up to, who this MOAKTB is going to be directed to. So like other parables, Jesus choosing the characters in the story was so he could bring about the biggest impact on the hearer. He wanted to create a huge difference, diversity between the characters. He wanted to bring a huge contrast between the two, so that when you heard it, you really started to either attach yourself to one or attach yourself to the other, and to really bring about a great emotional response. So this is what he has. He goes on to the next verse, and he tells us who is going to be there. So he says, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. All right, so Bible knowledge here. He says 2 men went up to the temple to pray. What does that tell you about those 2 men? What must they have been? Jews, right? 2 men went up to the temple to pray. And we'll see that there's obviously a little bit more evidence to that later on, but had to be 2 Jews going to the temple to pray. He says 2 men, but his audience had to know that they were 2 Jews, because why else would anybody else but a Jew go to the temple to pray? So he doesn't say 2 Jews, he just says 2 men, but he says 2 men go to the temple to pray. All right, I know who he's talking about. He's saying 2 Jews. So they have something in common right there. They are both Jews, fears of God, going to the temple to pray. But then he starts to add in the difference here, the contrast. He says, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And that's where they're starting to get a little, wait a second, where's he going with this? Because the Pharisee, obviously, and there would be Pharisees maybe listening, would say, oh, okay, that makes sense, a Pharisee going to the temple to pray. That's what us Pharisees do. We're uber religious people. We go to the temple to pray. But this tax collector, why would he be going to the temple? He probably went to the temple to tax collect. They wouldn't be thinking that this sinner by trade would be going to the temple to pray, because it just didn't seem like something that they would do. It would seem outlandish to them. And why would Jesus want to use this sinner by trade? And I say sinner by trade because tax collectors, they worked for Caesar. They went around and collected taxes. But again, if you're said, hey, I need $10, but if you can collect 20, keep the other 10. What are you going to do? Yeah, I know, everybody here would collect $10. Exactly, tax collectors. But that's what it was. So they looked down on them. They weren't the most honest people. So I say a sinner by trade. Some dishonest dealings in what they did. So those are the 2 people that Jesus uses as an example to go in to the temple to pray. Now, he focuses first on the Pharisee. Goes on to the Pharisee, and he says, the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, adulterers, robbers, evildoers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give 1/10 of all I get. And what a humble prayer, right? But when it says he stood by himself, don't think that he stood off in a corner by himself. That just probably means he didn't go gather with a group, but kind of stood in the middle by himself so he could be seen. You ever see someone just standing in the middle, there's a crowd, and then there's someone standing in the middle talking to themselves, and where's your attention directed? Towards that person. A few years ago, while we were still up in Kentucky, my father-in-law, we're visiting him at this festival in Charleston, West Virginia. More kind of like a bluegrass festival, a lot of violins, fiddles, eating corn, that kind of thing. A lot of people scattered throughout small little groups, but my father-in-law decided that, and Christy, listen, I have permission to tell this story because she'll laugh at it too. She was there. He needed to stretch, I guess. And not just like stretch, I mean like stretch. And so he went to the middle where there was nobody, a big open patch of grass. And he starts stretching, and I'm not going to get down in the position because I may not get back up. And people are walking by him and looking at him, and one guy even walked up to him, and we're sitting there laughing. I was like, I bet you they think he's probably having a heart attack. And honestly, someone did stop to see if he was okay. I don't know if he did it to draw attention to himself, but there are times when people do things to draw attention to themselves, and I believe that this is one of those times. The Pharisee standing there so everybody could kind of see how uber religious he was in his prayer, how he thanked God that he wasn't like certain people. And he might have even been saying, like robbers or evildoers or adulterers, kind of helping God know who's who. Or even like that tax collector. See, obviously he saw the tax collector, right? Because he's saying, or even like that tax collector. Pointing out the people that he knows he's glad he's not like. But remember who Jesus is talking to here. He's talking to the group of people who consider themselves righteous, or they are very confident in their own righteousness, and they look down on others. And sometimes we give Pharisees a hard time because we like to say that they were bad people. But on the outside, they were doing everything that a person of God should do. If you looked at a Pharisee and you wanted to know, how am I supposed to at least go through the motions of being a person of God, a Pharisee would be someone to look at. They went through the routines. They didn't want to get caught in any major moral scandal because then that would make them look bad. And they did not want to look bad. They would be free from any major public sin because, again, they wouldn't want people to talk down about them. They wanted to be seen as someone who could properly obey the law, follow the law. And then it says, look down on everyone else. And I sometimes think that that's a product of the first thing. Because when you become confident in some achievement that you have made, you then start to look down on the people that have not achieved that. Think of the list that he uses here of his religious achievements. Well, I fast twice a week. So if he has reached that pinnacle of uber religiousness there, of being able to fast twice a week, he then starts to think to himself, if I can fast twice a week, why can't they? And then he starts to look down on them. If I can tithe the 10th of all I get, why can't they? So he starts to look down on them. And I'm going to be the guinea pig here today. I'm going to be the one that kind of confesses. I don't know if any of you have ever done this, but I'm guilty of it. I've got my list of religious accomplishments that I'm so proud of that I can't understand why someone else isn't on the same level as I am. For example, I don't drink. Now, okay, I used to be in the Navy, and it's dispensed like freely. So, yes, I used to drink heavily in the Navy. But when I gave my life over to Christ, I realized that's one of the things that I needed to stop doing in order to follow him the way that he wanted me to follow him, to be the man that he wanted me to be. So I stopped drinking, and now I'm at that point to where I would say close to being an alcoholic, and now a total abstainer. If I can't do that, why can't other people? And I look down on them. Because I go to a place, I go to a gathering with friends who are Christians, and they offer me a beer. I'm like, why? Offer me tea or something, and I start to look down on them a little bit. Swearing. Again, Navy. Right? I think the first led to the other. The drinking led to the swearing. But, you cuss like a sailor, right? That's where that comes from. So I did that heavily. Again, stopped it. Don't do it anymore. And then again, I hear my Christian friends using cuss words, and I'm like, how can they do that? And where do I place myself? Up here. I start moving myself up my spiritual ladder. And I start looking down on people inadvertently. But it's just a byproduct of where I think I am. And we've got these other things. Church attendance. How can you miss church? I don't know how you can miss church. I never miss church. How can you wear that to church? I would never think of wearing that to church. And whatever it is that you think that you've achieved spiritually, when someone else is falling short there, then you start to look down on them because you think, how can they not get it if I get it? And that's where this looking down on others comes from, is that idea that you're confident in your own righteousness. See, the people who Jesus was talking to were most likely accomplished in the ways of obedience to the law and to God, but exhibited some pride as a result of it. And Jesus was using the Pharisees in this parable to draw attention to this kind of behavior. Now let's pan to the tax collector. Pharisee doing his thing, tax collector goes to do his thing. Verse 13, but the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Not even looking up. And when it said he stood at a distance, probably off in the corner somewhere, not wanting to draw attention to himself, but still seen by the Pharisee, over here just, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And it made me think of that person that comes into church and stands off to the side. Maybe a woman that comes in and she's off in the corner crying because she just found out that she's pregnant and the father wants to have nothing to do with her, and she's crying. And we look at her and we think, well, at least I'm not like her. Or the man that's just the words to worship are getting to him and he's beating his breast because his drug addiction just cost his marriage. And we see what he's doing and we think, well, at least I'm not like him. Woo, I'm having a great time. At least I'm not like him. Jesus tells this story in response to people being confident in their own righteousness. And he begins with an uber righteous man and a man who is sinner by trade, walking into the temple to pray. And one of them leaving justified before God. And now, of course, the audience is sitting there listening. They're like, all right, so here's the deal. We've got, in summary, of course, we've got this Pharisee who's standing over here praying, saying all these great things about himself and bad things about other people, and talking about all his religious accomplishments, and he's saying it so everybody can hear him. And then you've got this person that everybody in there knows is a sinner, and he's over there not even looking up to heaven, but saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Today, many different people with many different religious accomplishments and many different sins enter churches all over the world. Which ones are going to leave the church justified before God? First, let's take the religiously accomplished. How do they feel when they leave church? If you know that you have all of these religious accomplishments and you leave church, you feel justified. You want to know how you feed that feeling of justification? Again, I might have been guilty of this a time or two. You're in the car on the way home from church with your spouse, and you look over to him or her and you say, did you see what so-and-so was wearing? I would never wear that. I am glad I am not like them. Or, oh yeah, well, Mrs. Blank was on her phone again during the sermon. I'm glad I'm not like her. Well, I heard Mr. So-and-so cheated on his spouse. I'm glad I'm not like him. Oh, well, Miss Single Lady, during Sunday school prayer, said that she's going to have a baby. I'm glad I'm not like her. And that's what we do. We feed that feeling of justification by saying, at least I'm not like them. Because we pay attention to them in church. We see the people that are struggling. We see them, and we look for the sins of someone else so we can at least say, well, at least I'm not like them. And we feel justified. All of our endeavors to be the religious elite have allowed us to look down on others and be thankful we are not them. But this is not how we leave the church justified before God. Now remember what order it went. The Pharisee condemning the sins of others and bragging on himself. The tax collector not even looking up, asking God for mercy. Jesus is going to roll into the MOKTB here in just a second. He says, I tell you the truth that this man, talking about the tax collector, rather than the other, went home justified before God. Man, I wish I could have seen their reactions, because you know how they like to kind of get passionate about their, what are you talking about? They're probably like ripping out their beard hair and tearing their clothes, and they're like, oh, I can't take it anymore. What do you mean? How are they the ones that went home justified before God? Didn't you just hear what he just said? The Pharisee fasts twice a week, and he gives a tenth of all he gives. How in the world is this guy the one that goes home justified before God? Jesus, you're out of your mind. You must be crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. Right? We sit here and we're like, how in the world can that person go home justified before God when I've accomplished all of these things? And I love it. And it's that emotional response that I'm sure that Jesus is just waiting for. He's waiting for him to get mad. Waiting for him to be like, you don't know what you're talking about. This is crazy. And then here it is. He drops the truth bomb. The MOKTB. He says, for all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, I get it now. Talking about the Pharisee, all he did was exalt himself, and he will be humbled. And they should know, you would assume that they know the Bible, but I'm going to read to you from Isaiah real quick, because this is a passage that I'm sure that they were familiar with. But in Isaiah chapter 1, and in Isaiah, this is a vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem that Isaiah had. And starting in verse 13, listen to what Isaiah says concerning what he heard from God. He says in verse 13, stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations. I cannot bear your evil assemblies, your new moon festivals, and your appointed feasts. My soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Even if you offer many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. And then he goes on to tell them what they should do. But listen to what he's saying. 700 years before Jesus even delivered this parable, God was identifying a problem that his people had. And it wasn't that they were short on following ritual, because what did he acknowledge? You do all these things. You offer all these prayers, yet I hide my eyes from you. He wasn't concerned with the content or frequency of their prayers. He was concerned with the content of their hearts. And then he goes on, Isaiah in chapter 2, verse 17. The arrogance of man will be brought low, and the pride of men be humbled. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. See, we don't come here to exalt ourselves. That's not why we're here. We're not here to boast about our religious accomplishments, because if we do that, then we should be in fear of being humbled ourselves. And so that's what makes this tax collector an extraordinary person. And I'm going to go back to that original definition, because it says he does something that is out of the ordinary. One of the definitions is just doing something that's out of the ordinary. What is ordinary in reference to what we've been talking about now? Ordinary is to walk into church and to find the people that you are more accomplished than. That's ordinary. I'm not saying everybody in here is guilty of that, but I would have to say that more often than not, you're more likely to walk in and find the people that you're more religiously accomplished than looking for those that are more accomplished than you. And so that is ordinary. Ordinary is wanting everybody to think that you have it all together. I watched this video a few weeks ago. I was going to have it in here, but it was a little lengthy. But how it starts, a husband and wife wake up to realize that they overslept. They slept through the alarm clock on Sunday morning. Bam, time to get up and get ready for church. So they wake up, they start running around, they're grabbing the kids, throwing them out of bed, telling them to go put some clothes on. They're running, finding the nicest, cleanest press thing that they have in the closet. Some of you are like, were you watching me this morning? Okay. So then their kids are like, oh, can I have a corn dog for breakfast? And I'm like, I don't care what you have for breakfast, just eat, we got to get out the door. And so they're like shaving the cat and painting the walls, and you're just like trying to throw stuff on, and finally you get them in the car. And you get them in the car and you're driving, and okay, the husband's shaving and the wife's putting on makeup and all this other stuff, and the kids in the back are still fighting with each other, and you're like, I'll turn this car around, and you know you're not going to turn the car around. Kids, they're probably not going to turn the car around. They'll say it over and over again. I'm sorry I exposed that truth here this morning. But the fact is you're going to church and you're threatening them and everybody's screaming, your makeup's getting smeared, your beard's not even, but finally you get everything looking good. You pull into the church parking lot, you bring the kids to children's church, you walk into the sanctuary and you're glowing. You look great. And everybody sees you and you're like, oh my goodness, you look great today. And they shake your hand and they give you hugs and they're like, oh, your dress is beautiful. And you're like, oh, this whole thing, oh, it's rags, you know. And they're complimenting you, and they're saying to each other, they've got it all together. Every Sunday they come in here looking great. They must have it all together. Because that's what we want people to think. We want people to think we have it all together. We want to be like that Pharisee and let people know that we have it all together, and maybe not everybody else does. But that's not how we go home justified before God. So my question for you today is, do you want to go home justified before God? There are two ways. Humble yourselves before others. Don't place yourself above others. Humble yourselves before them. Okay? Instead of saying, I'm glad I'm not like them, say, I'm glad they're not like me. Imagine if you prayed like that. God, I am glad they are not like me. Don't be afraid to allow people to know that it's not all okay. I love the song, It's Okay to Not Be Okay. We just don't stay that way, right? But it's still okay to not be okay because we're all sinners. Every single one of us has that in common here today. We are all sinners. We got to stop acting like we're not, and sometimes maybe even throwing ourselves at the mercy of God and praying for forgiveness from that sin. And every Sunday when that invitation is offered, it's not just offered for people who've never committed their life to Christ. It's offered to anybody who needs prayer. And sometimes I look and I mean, man, we're in a great church. Nobody needs prayer. Nobody comes forward, so we're like, woo, we are the uber religious. We don't need it. We're good. It's not just for those who are making that one-time commitment. It's those that are trying to make that commitment stronger and stronger every day by realizing that, God, I still need your mercy because I am still a sinner. So we humble ourselves before others so they know that we are in need of that. But then we humble ourselves before God. We humble ourselves before God. God, I'm not accomplished. I'm changed. Maybe not accomplished, but I am changed. And all these things are different about me, but I am still a sinner. Paul, who we study from, called himself the chiefest of sinners. And again, you want to be like, duh, Paul, what are you talking about? But then Paul's like, haven't you read this? This is what he's getting at. So we humble ourselves before God. At the age of 82, John Newton said, "My memory is nearly gone, but I remember two things, that I am a great sinner and that Christ is a great Savior." And that's how we humble ourselves before God. We are a great sinner, but Christ is a great Savior. And the best part about this whole parable is I told you that they didn't name the tax collector, they didn't name the Pharisee, because this parable transcends all time. You could either be the Pharisee or the tax collector. The question is, how do you want to leave here today? And you can control that. You can be extraordinary in your humility. Let us pray.